The bell rang with a toneless certainty that somehow managed to feel almost ceremonial, as if the metallic tongue of the old school hall were tolling out a memory it could barely recall. The hallway breathed footsteps, came and went, in staggered waves, and the walls themselves shifted, as if the building still learned the shape of every student who passed through. The daylight spilled along the floor in prismatic shards, coloring the air with pale rainbows that flickered whenever someone blinked. It wasn't a normal bell. Not here. Not in this city where time wore a different skin every dawn. Miko stood in the transition zone between the old wing and the new wing, a pocket of stillness where the light fractured and reassembled itself into new angles each moment. A single strand of copper-tinted hair hung across her face, catching glints from the humming strips overhead. She wore her uniform with the bare minimum of care, the way an outcast wears the last piece of a uniform that fit once, and now does not fit at all. A thing kept for memory rather than for use. Her arms carried the quiet weight of augmentation, and the heavier weight of what augmentation could never be. The notice, an implant coiled behind her skull, just above the spine, fed a stream of micro-memories into her consciousness. Artificial experiences, curated scenes of safe, controllable lives, the taste of a grandmother's apple pie, the scent of rain on a tin roof, the moment you realize you can breathe underwater for 12 seconds. Miko kept these memories close because they kept her company when the world around her grew loud with truths she could not bear to hear. The artificial ones were easy to control. The real ones, whenever any of them surfaced in her thoughts, were often too bright to bear, too sharp, and they always carried the risk of shattering everything she had learned about who she was. The school, the so-called Lumen Academy, a misnomer perpetuated by a population that worshipped light and could no longer tell the difference between a lamp and a god, stood on a plateau that had once been a riverbank. Now it was a city-blocked monument to discipline and purity, with corridors that looped back on themselves like cognitive paradoxes. The hallways had begun to fold themselves into impossible geometric shapes somewhere in the mid-teen years. When the city decided that memory needed more than education, it needed artful, psychological architecture. And every year the bell rang, a reminder that time could be bent but not forgiven. The architecture listened to the bell and changed its angles to keep pace with the learners' changing minds. Miko wasn't like most of the others who walked these halls with an easy sense of belonging. Their paths had always been mapped, their futures already charred into a pattern. They were the gene pure, they bore the clean lines of a design approved by glossy sanctioned journals that spoke in the language of consent and inevitability. She was an outcast. A glitch in the system. Her memory implants occasionally produced visions that did not belong to the staged past of the city's approved history. The AI monitors, glacially kind, curiously smug, always looked at her with a particular kind of pity, a pity that smelled faintly of judgment and potential removal. She heard the clunk of a latch somewhere beyond the bend, a sound that did not belong to a school's normal chorus of doors. It was a soft, ferrous click, like something being pried open from the inside. Miko's attention flicked, not with alarm, but with a practical awareness that she was always anxious to have. In this city, anxiety meant you survived a little longer, or at least you remembered to survive. The hallways here carried stories in their angles, and today they carried a rumor Miko had never cared to listen to before. The rumor traveled in whispers that traveled across grids and memory streams. The rumor that Aaron, the most infamous of the gene-pure rebels, was inside the black market this morning, moving with the careful recklessness of someone who knows the world's thresholds can be crossed and will be crossed. If you listened to the rumor carefully enough, you could hear the way whispers sounded like experimental notes, like someone writing in a weather diary about a storm that would begin and never end. Aaron did not look like a rebel in the way many rebels looked. He was lean in the waist and heavy in the eyes, with a jaw that measured every lie against a wall he believed to be invisible. He wore clothes that were too clean for a city that thrived on disposable identities. He wore a scarf with a pattern that resembled a sentence in a foreign language, a script of left-handed curves that looked almost like a warning. He did not glisten with the same synthetic light that the others wore. No LED threads, no implanted halos, though his hair bore a pale, almost luminescent quality from some mutation of dye and engineering. He looked like someone who had learned to speak in the half-dark, where truth could slip away in a single note. He stood near the entrance to a backlane market, a market that existed in the shadows, even when the city's instrument police claimed there was nothing there but the ordinary rhythm of commerce. It was a market where memories could be traded as risk and reward, where artificial experiences traded hands for real ones, real experiences that could set a life on a different axis entirely. The memory economy in this city was not simply a luxury. It was the currency of proof, the evidence people used to claim ownership of themselves in a world that kept rewriting what it meant to be human. Miko's path drew her toward that place with the reluctance of someone who knows the price of what she seeks, but also the cost of what she refuses to admit she might lose. She paused at the edge of the market's entry, where a device hummed, a circle of light that condensed and released memory once more, a beacon to the curiosity that lived in the dark corners of all those who had come looking to rewrite their own pasts. "Augmented, aren't you, Miko?" a voice said from the crowd, a near-silent whisper that didn't expect her to reply, but did so anyway, because silence would have told a different story about her. The voice belonged to a trader wearing a mask of artfully chipped ceramic, eyes that seemed to see through her veneer, blinking with the curious patience of a person who had learned to wait forever for a molecule of truth to settle in a glass of poison. "I'm not here to trade with you today," Miko said, though part of her wished she was, because the possibility of trading with someone who could understand both the risk and the thrill of the exchange was always seductive, and this particular trader knew every trick in the book. The trader smiled, revealing teeth that looked as if they were carved from glass. "And yet you're here. The corridor of memory does not always demand a price, child. Sometimes it demands your patience, and sometimes your courage. You're here because you want something you can't hold in your hand, but the seller is very real." Miko looked away, toward the heart of the market where memory crystals rested in a towering edifice, a crystalline city of refracted experiences. The memories were embedded in small, clear prisms, each a quiet storm of a moment lived by someone else. The real memories, those not manufactured by a machine, but carried in the mind of a person, were traded in secret, for reasons that were both noble and monstrous, depending on who held the memory and why they chose to part with it. Aaron would not be one to buy a memory for a moment of convenience. He was not a person who traded away his core beliefs for a flash of comfort. He did not wear the city's approval like a badge. His skin bore the ache of a city that had demanded too much of him and given back too little. Miko stepped into the glow of the memory market's core, her own specialized implants quivering with the possibility that a fragment of someone else's life might slip into her own. She stood at a boundary that did not exist in a simple moral sense, the boundary between what was manufactured to feel real and what could become real by raw reality if she paid its price. A memory broker appeared, a man with the posture of a man who had seen too much to pretend it was all accidental. He wore a coat trimmed with the darkened sheen of dried memory crinkling, and his eyes held a patient sorrow that never found the right words to describe his work. He studied Miko as if reading a page of text that had been burned by a sun elsewhere in the memory. "You want to prove your humanity, child?" he asked, because there were many who would claim humanity in their own way, by kindness or by rebellion, or by the stubborn refusal to bow to any force that claimed to know the truth about what it meant to be human. "I want to keep from dissolving," Miko replied, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with the humility that comes from understanding how fragile a person could be when the world asked for too much truth at once. The broker's gaze drifted toward the tower of memories beyond them, a structure of prisons and rays that managed to look both ancient and new at the same time. The real memories lay there, in the hands of those who had a moment of truth to trade, and who were willing to face the consequences of that trade. "Your last true memory," the broker said finally, almost as a question more than a statement. "The city will ask for something in return. It always does." Miko's throat tightened. Her last true memory, the memory she refused to surrender, because it was the last moment when the girl she once was still believed in something more than the breath that kept her alive, lay somewhere inside her chest, beating with the slow, stubborn rhythm of a heart that didn't want to forget. "What price?" she asked, knowing she would hear it regardless of whether she asked. The broker's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A memory of someone else's life," he said. "A real memory, not a borrowed feeling. A memory that contains a choice, the choice to live as a human being with vulnerability rather than as a curated impression of humanity." You would trade your artifices for the raw, unscripted moment of someone else's life. You would carry that memory forward, and nothing would be the same again. Miko exhaled, a breath that tasted like rain and solder. The word trade sounded in her ears like a verdict she had known would come, only she had hoped it would be later, not now, not when she still believed she could have both the illusion and the truth. It was then that a new figure cut through the crowd, stepping into view with the quiet, careful step of a person who did not want to alarm the market, but craved the kind of attention that a marketplace would give the wrong sort of attention to. Aaron paused at the edge of the crowd, looking at the memory crystals with a sort of reverence that made them seem almost sacred. Then his gaze settled on Miko with a familiarity that felt like an unexpected gravity in a room that otherwise existed for risk. "Do you want to know what it feels like to be human?" he asked her, more a challenge than a question, as if the very act of speaking to Miko through a crowded market was a test. Her eyes met his, not with anger or fear, but with something darker, something more honest. She did not want to fight him because she did not want to fight herself. "You're here because you want to sabotage this," Miko answered, though the truth of her words sounded brittle, like glass that would crack at any moment. The city's power lay in the possibility of memory trades. It thrived on the belief that authenticity could be bought and sold, and crucially, that it could be controlled. Aaron did not blink. "I'm here because the market is a cancer that grows by feeding on fear," he said. And if his voice had any warmth, it was a warmth born of a cold determination not to fail. Before another word could be exchanged, a rising hiss, like a dragonfly caught in a storm of wind and electric current, rose from the core of the market. A ring of watchers swirled around them, as a device, a notorious model in the black market, flooded the space with a cascade of digital noise. The Real Memory Extractor, or RME, the tool that turned real memories into purchasable fragments, began to hum with a new frequency, the sound of something waking that should have stayed asleep. The broker looked between Aaron and Miko with a professional resignation. "That would be the price you pay for stepping into this ring," he said, almost to the whole crowd. "The RME does not respect your boundaries. It will take what you think you want and twist it into what you fear." The crowd parted, and a surge of wind carried with it a storm of little sparks of memory fragments, pearls of someone else's life scattered across the floor, like fallen snow that burned if you touched it. The memory market's core was alive with the energy of countless human experiences. It lived on the belief that one could own a fragment of reality that would anchor a sense of self. If you removed the anchor, you would drift into a new self or no self at all. Miko watched as a girl who looked a lot like her, perhaps a her from another timeline, a version of herself that belonged to a life she could barely imagine, suddenly jerked, as if the air itself had turned into water and her mind had tried to swim away from it. The memory was not hers any longer, not in any secure sense, but it hung around the market like a memory ghost, a reminder of a price paid for a life that could not be undone. Aaron pressed closer to Miko, not to touch her, but to be near enough to project his intent without words. "We do not do this for the sake of rebellion alone," he whispered, loud enough to be heard by those within earshot, quiet enough to avoid the police drones circling above. We do this because if the market thrives, it will erase more than it saves. It will erase the nuance of what makes you human. Miko's breath trembled. It was a tremor she could not quite suppress. A tremor of fear and possibility. A line between her humanity and the hum of the artificial came into focus with frightening clarity. If she did not take back the last true memory, the memory that would tell her who she truly was in the simplest, most stubborn sense, she might not be Miko at all in the future she was being pushed toward. But if she did surrender that memory to acquire a real memory of someone else's life, would she still be Miko? Or would she become just a vessel carrying someone else's story? The broker's voice cut through the murmuring like a blade. Time to decide. The price is as real as the memory. He gestured to the prism towers beyond them, where a large crystal hummed with life and the faint glow of a real memory contained within it. A memory not borrowed, not synthetic, but something older, something human. A memory, or a signal of that memory, flickered through Miko's mind. A voice, rough and warm at once, singing the same lullaby Miko had used to thin her fear when she was small. A grandmother's voice, but different, older. Perhaps a memory of a grandmother who never existed in the city's official history. The lullaby had the power to quiet the mind in a way nothing else did. It was a real memory, if it existed. It would be real in a way that the artificial ones could never replicate. But to access it would require an exchange, a surrender. Which does a human mind choose when both options threaten to undo it all? Aaron asked, his voice a low rumble of almost sexual intensity, the kind of question that makes a person lean in or retreat. Miko looked at him with eyes that had learned to measure every possible path through a problem. Every possible cost. She thought of the last memory she could not bear to surrender even to a real memory. The moment she realized she could tell a lie and feel the weight of all that truth behind it. The moment she realized she could create a second self to survive in a world that demanded more truth than she could handle. It was that moment when the market's core suddenly pulsed, and the RME began a slow, deliberate chant. It wasn't a noise exactly. It was a language of memory and mechanical mercy, and it was telling them something they did not want to hear. The device was not simply extracting real memories, it was twisting them, putting them through a dangerous coil of feedback loops that could trap a person in a certain cognitive echo and never let them out. Aaron stepped between Miko and the device, his hands open, his palms facing outward as if to say to the machine that it had to listen to a different law than the one it was obeying. If we do this, if either of us gives up what we hold most dear, the city will begin to forget us, he said, his voice a mixture of threat and plea. Or perhaps it will begin to remember us. In a different way, Miko replied. And the words came out with a strength she hadn't known she possessed until that very moment. If I surrender my last true memory, I will still be myself. I will carry a real memory inside me, a memory that a machine cannot conjure with a script or heuristic. If I keep my last true memory, I risk becoming something else, an imperfect idea of humanity that is as much a suit of armor as a prison. A murmur rose in the crowd, a chorus of voices that did not decide anything, but suggested that a decision was imminent. The market's core grew brighter, its color shifting through the spectrum, as if a storm of possibilities danced in front of them. And then a voice rose above the murmur, the voice of the broker, the voice of the city, the voice of the world that spoke to them through memory and time. Choose, he said, not to force them to choose, but to reveal to them the weight of choice. Miko closed her eyes and breathed in through her nose, letting the breath travel down into the pit of her chest, where she kept her most stubborn self. The sound of the crowd faded, the hum of electricity dulled to a whisper, and the memory of a child singing that lullaby swelled in her mind, not as a memory she owned, but as something she remembered loving. A lullaby had saved her once, not because she was saved by it, but because it gave her a moment of pure clarity in a world that demanded she be other than she was. She changed her mind. Or perhaps she found a different stage of the same decision. The last true memory did not leave her. It did not vanish into the ether of borrowed experiences, or expend itself in a way that would degrade her humanity. It stood in the back of her mind, waiting, a stubborn, undulating beacon of who she was. If she surrendered it now, she would become someone else who had learned to love the idea of humanity more than the truth of it. If she kept it, perhaps she would never again feel entirely safe in a city that feasts on fear and the hope of making the past manipulable. A sudden gasp ran through the crowd as a new possibility formed, a plan that did not entirely belong to either Aaron or Miko, a path that was neither the destruction of a black market nor the preservation of a fragile self. It was born from a collaboration of necessity, from the sense that both sides in this contest needed something other than control. The plan was to dismantle the RME, not by overpowering it, but by reconfiguring the memory stream so that it could not trap minds in it, but would rather return to its rightful use, to remind people that memory is a shared, living history, rather than a private possession. Aaron, for the first time in the memory market's history, looked at Miko not as an enemy, but as a potential ally in a risk they shared. He did not smile, because there was nothing in his coalition that could be called a smile. But he nodded very slightly, a silent agreement that they could move forward together. The broker's face, normally a mask of practiced calm, revealed a flicker of something like astonishment. "You propose a plan that does not involve selling a memory," he said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "What you propose is dangerous in a different way. To renegotiate the fabric of this economy, to reweave it so it no longer feeds on fear and plausibility. It's a radical cure." "It's a radical truth," Miko answered. "If the truth would not come to them, they would have to travel to it. The plan would require them to pull the real memories out of circulation, not to erase them, but to reroute their power to reveal the city's shared humanity rather than the private hunger that lurked behind every trade." The RME's hum intensified, the prism tower ahead pulsing with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The market's architecture around them, corridors that looped, staircases that never ended, rooms that expanded into other rooms, seemed to respond to the suggestion of change, softening at the edges as if the very walls were listening to them. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and something sweeter, like sugar, burned on a low flame. A small device appeared on the market floor, a compact obelisk that exuded a pale blue light. It had no name and no brand, only a presence, the sense that it belonged to something older than the city's current memory system, something human and stubborn. It hummed with a language all its own, a language that Miko could almost understand if she listened long enough. It spoke not in words, but in a pattern of sparks that flickered in a rhythm akin to the beating of a heart. A rhythm that told her, directly into her mind, that there existed a memory which could be shared rather than owned. A memory of a time when people learned to care for one another beyond the desire to possess. Aaron reached out and touched the obelisk with the calloused palm of his hand. The memory market crowd watched in tense awe as the device began to absorb the crowd's attention, dividing it between fear of change and curiosity about possibility. The obelisk's blue glow spread outward, a river of light that moved through the people, not into them, but around them, as if memory itself was being rerouted to a new riverbed. It was the first time Miko felt the city's memory begin to reconsider its own power. "Let us show them," Aaron whispered, and his words carried a weight of history behind them, distant, but not unrecognizable. He spoke of a plan to decouple the RME's coercive loop by introducing a basic framework of consent and reciprocity, a way to ensure that any memory exchange would require both sides to choose it freely, with full knowledge of the consequences. It would be a system of mutual memory accountability, built around a black market device that was repurposed rather than reinforced into something almost innocent and almost moral. Miko realized that the plan, as dangerous as it was, also had the potential to reclaim agency for people who had grown used to surrendering that agency to the market's silent gods of progress. If the city learned to see memory as something shared rather than owned, maybe the real memories, the ones that could anchor a person to the world without the fear of losing themselves, could become the currency of solidarity rather than control. The idea demanded a moment of quiet, and the moment came not from the crowd's silence, but from within Miko herself. She thought of the lullaby again, the memory she had never allowed herself to forget. It had anchored a sense of unconditional love she had learned to rely on in her earliest years, before the city taught her to doubt every sentiment as a potential vector of manipulation. If she handed over that lullaby, it would be gone from her. But if everyone found that lullaby together within the shared memory, perhaps no person would be alone again in the dark. Aran stepped back, giving her room to choose, though the room was a moving thing. The entire market seemed to tilt toward them, as if listening to them in the way a church listens to its choir. "You don't have to decide alone," he whispered, the words almost intimate, as if he wanted to reassure her that he would not let her bear the burden unassisted. Miko closed her eyes again and listened to the city's hidden hum, the hum of thousands of people who had lived and who would live again in someone else's memory if they were brave enough to let their own selves be used as a source for others' survival. The thought of a world where people did not fear trading real memories because those memories would be safeguarded by a consent-based system seemed almost miraculous, improbable enough to be true, and tempting enough to be dangerous. She looked at the broker, who stood with the patience of a man who had seen many mimetic storms rise and fall. And then she looked at Aran, whose stance suggested a readiness to burn down the old world, to raise up a new one. They both offered a different version of humanity, both necessary to the city's survival and its gradual decay. "Okay," she said at last, and the hallways seemed to quiet in response, listening to her choice as though it were a verdict. "We do this not to destroy the market, but to transmute it, to transform it into something that can sustain memory's power without exploiting it. If you're willing to work with me, Aaron, I'll trade nothing of mine but the shared future." Aaron's eyes glittered with the kind of light that is not commonly called hope in a place like this. That look suggested a plan moving from concept to reality, one that would require precise, almost surgical operation on the network of memory that bound the city's people. The broker's reaction was a slow, careful nod. "Then we take the risks together," he said, as if the old law that governed memory once again found its voice in the present. "We do not let fear decide what we are anymore. We do not let the market decide for us what a person is or should be." What happened next was a slow unfolding, rather than a sudden eruption. The plan required a reconfiguration of the memory stream, a rerouting that would make it possible for real memories to be accessed, not as private property, but as a shared resource that any person could draw upon with consent and accountability. To achieve that, the system needed a new kind of interface, a way to register consent in the mind itself, so that the moment a memory was requested, the mind would have to recognize and declare its own willingness to share it or to trade it away. They began with the obelisk, the device that had sparked the idea in the first place. They added a second mechanism, a sort of memory ledger that resided within the city's network, a ledger not of profit and loss, but of trust and reciprocity. Each memory exchange would be logged, and every memory would carry with it a pledge, a promise that the memory belonged to its original wearer and would not be used against their will or to harm them or their loved ones. It was a dangerous experiment, the kind of experiment that would have made the old world tremble, because it challenged the core assumption that memory is an asset to be bought, and a person's life is a product to be sold. It required the city's institutions, however compromised they were, to accept a new rule. It required the memory traders to become stewards, not masters. The RME's chanting did not stop, but its tone changed, as if a new melody had been introduced into a symphony that had always known fear. The memory prisms, previously bright and alluring, began to glow with a softer, more human light, as if the mere act of consent in the mind was enough to alter their crystalline surfaces. Miko found herself standing at the edge of the product of change era, a line between what had once been possible and what would now be allowed to happen. The last true memory, no longer a weapon or a shield, but a core of self-preservation, stood behind her chest, pressed against the rib bone of her own heart, reminding her that she had not entirely surrendered to the city's appetite for control. The moment of ultimate risk was not directly a sacrifice, but a rebirth. She would not be forced to surrender her memory. Instead, she would share the power of that memory with the market's ledger. She would place the memory in the new system's trust ledger, a digital lock that could be opened only by those who had proven their own humanity through their deeds within the system. If the system functioned properly, it would allow a person to retrieve their memory later if they chose, but only if they respected the premises of consent and reciprocity. The sequence required multiple participants, including Aaron, several brokers, a group of students who had joined the market out of personal desperation rather than greed, and a few security minds who were willing to risk their careers for a principle they watched slipping through their fingers every day. It was not a simple swap of one memory for another. It was a reweaving of the city's memory economy's moral fiber. A final hour came with the soft rain of memory particles, a rain that fell in the city's memory plazas and pooled in pockets of the ground, where a new kind of memory energy could be harvested for the first time without causing harm. The obelisk glowed with a steady blue light that pulsed in time with the city's own heartbeat. A quiet anticipation settled over the market, a sense that something irrevocable had begun and could not be undone. Miko stepped forward, her head held high, not with arrogance, but with the humility of someone who had decided to trust others with the parts of herself that mattered most. She stood in front of the market's core and faced the ledger, the mind's memory record that would hold her last true memory within the safe and public square of memory exchange. It would not be a surrender to the city. It would be a gift to it, an act that would, in the eyes of the city, demonstrate humanity not by conformity to a budget, but by a willingness to share one's deepest moments with strangers. The moment she placed her hand on the ledger's cool, glassy surface, Miko felt a tremor pass through her, a sensation like stepping into cold water and finding it unexpectedly warm on the other side. The memory, her lullaby, the long, silent sound that had kept her sane in the hours when fear tried to swallow her voice, began to breathe inside the ledger, a living thing that could be heard in the quietest places. A memory that did not belong to anyone, yet belonged to her body in a way that no memory ever truly could, because it was not just hers. It was the shared childhood of 100 different versions of her, of people who did not exist but who had lived inside her for years. Her last true memory did not vanish. It found its own kind of home inside the city's memory ledger, a place where it could be accessed by those who had earned the right to share it, and who could be trusted to treat it with care. It did not become a private possession any longer. It became part of a common human reservoir from which all could draw courage, fear, tenderness, and the stubbornness of a soul that refused to be dissolved by a system that wanted to sell it to the highest bidder. Aaron stepped forward, and the crowd parted again, not out of fear this time, but out of respect for the act they had just witnessed. He placed his own hand on the ledger's surface, a sign that he would take on the responsibility of guarding the new order, that he would be a guardian of a memory-based trust, rather than a vandal of a market that thrived on trust's absence. The broker, the ledger, the market, these abstractions of a city that had long dreamt of control, began to settle into something more coherent, something that looked a lot less like a battlefield and a lot more like a shared road. The RME ceased its relentless chanting, its sensors finally finding a new rhythm that did not require terror, but required participation, accountability, and respect. In the days that followed, the memory market did not disappear. It reformed. Memory exchanges were now bound by the memory ledger's enforceable rules, a system designed to keep memory safe and to ensure that those who shared a memory would do so out of choice and not coercion. The price would be paid not in pain, but in responsibility. And the reward would be not wealth, but the maintenance of human dignity. A city built on memory would have to prove that memory could be used to heal as well as to hurt. Miko found that she was not as frightened of losing herself as she had imagined. The last true memory remained a static presence in her chest, but its meaning had shifted. It no longer stood as a solitary seal on a sealed box she carried within. It had become an anchor in a net of shared experiences, a lighthouse that others could follow when their own seas grew dark. The lullaby, once her last private protection against a world that did not care to protect its people, now belonged to the people. It belonged to a collective memory that could be accessed through consent, shared freely, and protected by the city's new governance. Aaron's rebellion did not vanish with the city's change either. He remained a figure who feared a future where even rebellion would become something bought and sold in the markets of thought. Yet the rebellion matured into something else, a vow to ensure that any future generation would have a choice, an actual choice, not merely the illusion of choice offered by a system hungry for control. The city's notion of self grew more complicated, more intricate, more human, and less merely a product of a technological determinism that had once promised salvation with the flicker of a switch. People began to tell stories again, not the sanitized myths the Academy produced, not the memory-constrained histories that the power brokers preferred, but new stories of what it meant to share the burden of living in a world where memory was the most valuable thing anyone could own. They told stories about the times when a girl with an augmented memory and a boy who believed in a purer humanity stood side by side, not as opponents, but as witnesses to the same truth. Humanity is not the sum of the memories you possess, but the willingness to protect the memory of others as if it were your own. The city did not become free in the sense of being ungovernable. It found freedom in a new sense, freedom from the coercive myth that memory is something you can own at a price you cannot pay without paying in your own sense of self. The market's old magic, the feeling that one could buy back a life at a convenience price, faded, and in its place there grew a different magic. The knowledge that memory can be a bridge rather than a weapon, a bridge built by consent and guarded by trust. The school bell's sound, the one that had started this entire chain of events, emerged one morning through the corridors with a softer, more hopeful tone, as if the bell itself understood the city's new state. The hallway that had bent into impossible shapes now kept its geometry, a stable, navigable path through which students could walk without fear of losing their way. The memory market's energy, once a bright storm around the central plaza, now burned in a more tempered glow, a reminder of what had been risked, what had changed, and what would be guarded for generations to come. Miko, who had stood at the nexus of this transformation, found herself moving through the school with a lightness she had not felt in years. She could still sense the artificial memories within her, the needles and threads of experiences that had helped her survive her childhood and avoid the worst of the city's predations, but they no longer defined or restricted her sense of self. They existed as memories do in a world that has learned to live with them, as quiet, sometimes intrusive, but ultimately optional, something she could call upon when needed, or set aside when they became too heavy to carry. She began to see herself not as a person in a city that demanded she be what it called human, but as someone who carried a mosaic of experiences, both real and curated, and learned to wield them with restraint, with curiosity, and with generosity. She learned to trust her own judgment again, to listen to the voice that had once told her she would always be an outsider, but had since become a voice that helped others find their way back to themselves. People began to notice the change. The halls of Lumen Academy no longer resembled a museum piece locked behind glass. They felt more like an open forum where memory and identity could be discussed without fear of erasure. The memory ledger did not erase the individuality of each person, but allowed each individual to participate in a larger, more humane economy of shared experiences. On a final afternoon before the term ended, Miko stood with Aaron under the arch of a now stable hallway that had once threatened to swallow people whole. The air tasted like rain on metal, the way a city's memory often tastes, and in the distance, the market's core, a glimmering beacon, shimmered with the quiet satisfaction of having been reformed rather than destroyed. Aaron turned his head toward her and offered a small, almost boyish smile. The kind of smile that did not pretend to erase the past, but said it was time to write a better one. "We did good work here," he said. Miko did not respond with bravado or bluster. She simply nodded, and for the first time in a long while, she believed that the future would not break her. The city continued to breathe, but now it breathed like a creature that had learned to live with its seasons, not one that needed to fight its weather to survive. The memory market, though never perfect, stood as a monument to a new truth, that humanity is not about owning memories, but about choosing what to share and what to protect, about the discipline to ask what a memory is for and who will be asked to bear its weight. The school bell rang again, the sound carrying a note of quiet triumph, a reminder that even a place built on fear could become a place built on trust. The halls straightened, the staircases found their regular rhythm, and the memory crystals aligned into a city where people could walk through without fear of becoming someone else's memory. And somewhere in the soft glow of a plaza filled with real and remembered warmth, a subscriber feed glowed with a line of posts. Like, share, and comment your theories. Subscribe for more unexpected futures. The line was part of the city now, a sign that the future's appetite for stories would always want new witnesses, new voices, new ways to understand what it means to be human. The city settled into its new life, the life of a memory that chose not to own, but to guide. Miko walked on, the last thread of her artificial memories still vivid in her consciousness. But now the thread was a tool rather than a shield, a connection to the living world rather than a barrier against it. She had traded something of herself to gain something more real. And in this exchange, she found something closer to humanity's heart, the capacity to be true to one's own past while still choosing to step forward into a future that could finally be trusted. And as the hallways settled into their new geometry, as the crystals hummed with a restrained energy, and as the city learned to tell the truth without breaking itself apart, the memory market's new order began to show signs of the one inevitable truth that had always haunted it. Memory is a shared vessel, and the act of sharing, done with consent and care, is the truest form of humanity there is. The bell rang again, and this time it rang with a gentler cadence, the sound of a future that had learned to listen. The world outside the school, where the city's towers rose like patient ladders toward the stars, held its breath for a heartbeat longer, and then exhaled, as if to say, "We will remember this moment. We will choose to be better. We will be human together." And so the day closed on a city that had learned to bloom in memory, a place where self's boundaries were not walls but bridges, and where each bridge was a memory freely shared, not a debt demanded by the market's old law. The story of Miko and Aaron did not end with a single echo of triumph. It found its new life in the recurring chorus of a city that refused to let fear define its future. A chorus sung by the many who now walked its halls and shared in its truth.